We are moving right along in this project of mine and going into Final Fantasy II. No, silly, not Final Fantasy IV, that was renamed Final Fantasy II upon international release to the US. Ha 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 ha, don't be silly, you little weirdo. I'm talking about old school, regular Final Fantasy II, a game that honestly isn't really in a lot of popular conversations about the series. Like, people will talk about the first one, the fourth one, the fifth one, the PlayStation era, how bad modern Final Fantasy games are because they can't turn you into a 5-year-old again or whatever, but 2 is often left out. And I do get it. Like, there's a lot about Final Fantasy that doesn't really work in the way that I think it maybe wanted to. Like, on paper, it's an incredibly daring idea, nestled comfortably within the age of NES games that are trying to not be carbon copies of the original title. Like, Zelda, Kirby, Mario, sort of. Fire Emblem, you get it. Instead of a more classical leveling system, FF2 levels your stats as they're used. The theory is that you can build, like, approximations of classes that you want. You want a big, beefy fighter type? Get a character in the front row and let them swing their weapons and take hits. You want a quiet caster? Back row and spam magic all day, every day. Like, the idea of it is fun, a pleasant unraveling of the more rigid world of the original Final Fantasy, but as everyone who actually knows about this game can attest, this hardly plays out like that. Usually the more casual experience of the game is spent grinding up spell levels and HP until you can eventually kind of just endure all the enemies hitting you first with their myriad status effects and griping as the game feels needlessly complicated and almost torturous. Nestling comfortably in the thrumming id of the internet's Final Fantasy district is one of the bad ones, but this is my channel, and I've committed myself to the idea that all mainline Final Fantasies are good, actually, so I bet you're wondering what on earth I have to say about this weird mess of a game. Like, you don't even get your airship until the second to last dungeon. Why would the game be this cruel? So, a lot of this comes from the stream playthrough I did on my Twitch, twitch.tv/my name, I guess, where I had kind of a delightful crash course by my weirdly knowledgeable chat on the weirder intricacies of the game. Final Fantasy II is almost hostile in what it refuses to tell you about how the game works. You can get an idea on the basic structure, bigger stats good, higher weapon and magic levels good. You may even, be perceptive enough to recognize that your stamina and your spirit stats dictate how much HP and MP you gain respectively. But I didn't realize how agility works, which is weirdly, that evasion has levels as well as, like, a percentile chance, leading, like, to characters with 99% evade getting hit pretty regularly. Like, that magic defense works the exact same way. It also has levels and a percentile chance, and that the higher level the spell is, the more it's just kind of like layering casts of the same spell on top of each other until you can outpace the enemy's magic defense. There's a lot. Look, a lot mechanically goes on in FF2, and the way it conveys that information to you outside of vague lines of dialogues from NPCs is that it doesn't, which renders the game very different between the people in and out of the know. I know I don't usually really talk about mechanics a lot in these essays, although I do end up talking about them at least a little bit because life is a nightmare, but it is fascinating how much obfuscation goes on in this game. There is a kind of visceral pleasure in reimagining my way through the game, like leaning into the things that kind of let me breeze through it, but, and here's why I'm talking about this in the first place, is it necessarily a bad thing that they don't tell you about these mechanics? Like, don't get me wrong, spamming Berserk and Blink and sweeping the endgame was very fun, but it felt oddly empty. Like, my memories of FF2 live in building up my magic spells and figuring out enemy weaknesses, exploiting them, farming for the strongest weapons in the game, and I think that casual approach was what the game was built around. That isn't to say that it's always a good idea to just hide the best strats from your player base by literally not telling them anything about magic penalties and Berserk's lack of a cutoff, but leaning into how the game wants casual players to engage with it complements the story, which is arguably, if we want to be callous cynics, the other big addition it's introduced into the series. Like, yes, the cast of Final Fantasy II has itself established characters, like Firion, who is nice, Maria, who is nice in a feminine way, Guy, who speaks Beaver and is the best character maybe in all of video games, and a variety of other characters that rotate in and out of your party. most of which die. Spoiler. The first time I beat this game, I really did feel like the world was this overwhelming, hostile place. Partially because if you stray too far off course at the start of the game, you get super murdered by mid to late game enemies, which is hilarious. But without knowing how to crush this game neath my cat heels, grinding felt risky but necessary. This big effort to try to make progress in a world that seemed intent and more than capable of ruining you. Now, we'll get back to both of these things in a bit, but I do want to say that this is, despite the kind of clunkiness of gaining stats and the more weird elements of the game, like status ailments having perfect accuracy when they're paired to physical attacks, this is archetypically Final Fantasy. Not to alarm anyone, but if you've ever seen speedruns of almost any game in the series, save like, I guess the PC NE percent of FF7, where you just kind of like sequence break and glitch it into the debug room and max everybody out in your party and warp to the final boss. Like, there's a lot of strategies involved that are not initially clear that can sweep through the game really quickly and usually at really low levels. The GBA run of this game, for example, involved getting really good at one of these slide puzzles, amassing a small fortune on a snow ship, buying every teleport book you can, and chasing your way to the Blood Sword, strap that bad boy onto Leon, clean up the final boss, and call it a day. It can feel weird that the series kind of tries to hide parts of itself from you, rewarding either the kind of bizarre ingenuity of unpacking all of this yourself somehow, or, paying out for some strategy guides brought to you by Nintendo Power. But it would be similarly weird for me to get hung up on this one game where it happened, though it is noteworthy, if nothing else than for just how much it affects the difficulty curve in the game. This is all well and good, but, there's something else, right? Beyond the mechanics of the game, this was the first game in the series that really took a swing for a story, right? It's easy to kind of gloss over the story of Final Fantasy numero uno, but we have, characters here. You spend a lot of time talking. FF2 is a literal mechanic based entirely around learning key terms and speaking them at other NPCs. That's gotta be worth a peek, right? I mentioned a few things about this already, that the mechanically casual approach to the game synergizes well with the tone of the game, and I mean what I said, so let's unpack that a little bit while I have you. I'm not so brazen in my weird love of this series to claim that Final Fantasy II is some sort of shining star of narrative. It is, by and large, very meat and potatoes, very much the same functional story of the previous game, where you're told to go to a place and clear a dungeon and come back, but they've more or less just tried to give a more consistent framework through it. You have one taskmaster, Hilda, and a little bit later on, I guess, Hilda and Gordon, who's giving you tasks to help the rebellion. Get Mithril to make stronger weapons, stop the Empire's dreadnought, and so on. It's a functional text, and a lot of similar hallmarks for the series really persist here. Most NPCs are just here to give you hints on how to proceed, or vague advice on how to gear your party, though maybe not the kind of advice you actually really need, which is use shields and cast Berserk, but okay, I'll drop it. So, what am I gonna say about this? Then, it is a more clearly defined narrative than the first game, undeniably, but it still follows really closely on the functional footsteps of its predecessor. It's really late. Tone, I think, is the obvious thing here. It was important to really dig into the mechanical elements of this game, in part because that's 90% of my fascination with the game and the footage you're seeing, and also because it's an interesting bit of synergy in the game. While I don't think the game tries to be explicit about it in all areas, the feeling I had wandering out into the abyss only to find enemies that just utterly destroy me made it feel like the world of Final Fantasy II was grim, oppressive, and dire. Wandering into enemy territory unprepared was going to get you killed, so you sneak along the bank to get to a town infested with soldiers that, if you talk to, will just up and kill you also. So you sneak around this town, finding, this out-of-the-way bar, to sneak around in there, find a dying prince, and by then, the game's tone, its feeling is kind of set, right? The feeling that you're small in this oppressive, hostile world, kind of sneaking around, netting small wins, evading terrifying enemies. It wasn't perfect, but I think the tone of the game can often really shine through. On top of all of this, the game will occasionally use really, shockingly excellent environmental storytelling. So, at one point your group is trying to track down and stop the dreadnought from launching. When you inevitably fail, you return to Altair, the place that you started the entire game in, only to find it full of, bomb scars, like ruined buildings, craters. This place was attacked, and no one's idling outside anymore, either dead or hiding in the headquarter building, or like I guess in their shops. But you can see these battle scars on some of the other towns too, like a constant physical reminder that the Empire has done real damage to this world. And if that's not enough for you, after reclaiming Flynn and setting up shop in your hometown, you're tasked to go on a quest to unlock Ultima, the tome. I guess not the game, but you go through a wild string of events leading in the death of Minwu, your first guest character, only to return with the tome to find out that the Empire has released a cyclone in the world, massive enough that it wiped Altair out entirely. Like, you can't even enter it anymore. In fact, it did that to 4 of the 8 total towns in the world. Like, in a way, you get to feel the real consequences of the Empire's actions, as all these places you visited had been wiped out. Half the population, arguably, of the Earth killed. This is excellent. Please don't take that out of context. But it really is a great narrative beat, especially considering the limited language of the game's era. The story is by and large conventional, the characters aren't exactly the most nuanced and textured, but it's moments like these that genuinely shine through in the game's construction. I mentioned at the start that you don't get the airship until the end of the game, and that's because Sid, the pilot, has been running a ferry service with it the entire time, so, you can get airdropped into locations if you want. But he lends it to you on his deathbed, dying from injuries he sustained during the cyclone attack. Like, the game has flaws. Many flaws. Flaws in how you progress through it, flaws with incredibly high encounter rates during the longer dungeon gauntlets, but to say there's nothing good or interesting or thoughtful in the game would be an incurious stance to take. And I don't think many would say something so dramatic, but I felt it needed to be said. To close things out in today's video, I want to revisit the big question of this series, and look at FF2 Pixel Remaster, the game we've been looking at this entire time. Now, this game was the reason I wanted to look into the remasters, all cards on the table, because I was told by someone, like the internet, vaguely, I guess, that this game rebalanced the final dungeon because it is notoriously too difficult. And I have memories of the GBA version that can corroborate with that. Getting to the final dungeon in this version, though, was weird, since the only real change I noticed for that dungeon specifically was that it seemed that they swapped the encounter rates. Like, usually entering Pandemonium starts with you encountering enemies that you've seen around already, kind of like scaling upwards until you get to the higher floors, where you're fighting horrible death murder knights that can one-shot anyone, and it's literally the worst thing. But in the remaster, they were all there right at the start, and by the time I was in the upper floors, I was back to fighting, like, golems and bombs and stuff. I don't know. More than that, I think the most significant change to FF2 specifically, aside from my rant about the minimap and auto-battle functions which still exist here, was that using 2 weapons in this game is fucking nutty. Like, I've never played a version of this game that let you retarget each separate weapon attack, which invented an entirely new method of breaking the game in half. Like, instead of just building and spamming teleport like the days of Eld, just spam Berserk and Blink, and let 2 of your big chunky lads sweep the field, which is what I did, because I didn't want to keep spamming teleport. Maybe this was also part of the rebalancing, but it was a decision I think that really does show what was at the heart of this remaster question, because this, unless I'm mistaken, is something made specifically for this version of the game, and I think it makes sense framing it as something that people will almost instinctively do in this game, right? Like, it's a pretty intuitive part of the game to put a bunch of weapons on and go swinging, so I can sort of see the trajectory to make this change in that it makes the game friendlier to players. Maybe that's part of it, then. Like, I don't know. As much as the feeling of playing this game has shifted radically from even other remakes, this feels less, I don't know, callous than the auto map / auto battle thing. Like, FF2 has a reputation for being kind of cruel. So maybe this change really was to help kind of improve the casual playing experience. I think that accessibility may be more at the heart of a lot of these changes, which in retrospect feels a little obvious, but I think that in itself is interesting. Like, you could argue that both of these changes are to improve accessibility, but the retargeting thing does feel more like a kindness to the player than the auto-map trivializing the exploration element of these older games, if nothing else. At the end of it all, this game, I think, gets overlooked a lot, not just because Final Fantasy II, in the minds of some American fans, will mean Final Fantasy IV, the much more popular game, but because a lot of it was really unintuitive, and the game as a whole didn't really give you a lot to feel powerful or in control about. And yet, I can't help but feel weirdly fond of this game. Like, even the remake trying to lessen the blow still charmed me. At least until, the encounter rate really started to grate on me. But I think there's a lot that gets overlooked in a game like this. It's easy to dismiss the flimsy story, the expedient, unassuming characters, the simplicity of a lot of its narratives and theming. Like, I don't know, wow, maybe the Empire is bad. Actually, we're struggling with that one still, never mind. But I can't really fault the effort on display to try and push at the boundaries of its predecessor. And, if letting you cut through enemies with guys dual-wielding axes lowers the barrier of entry, I guess I can't really fault that either. Special thanks to Art Kuhn, Brandon Haney, Caitlin Fisher, Kate Rose, Colleen T., Dexter A., Evan Kearns, Lewis Wells, Maria Aladren, Alistair V., Narai the Redmarked, Pahor, Professor Bopper, Saint Rawberry, Thomas Wolpez, and Zetetic.